Hello again, dear listener. You've arrived at the perfect time for a story from the past, told gently and slowly as night wraps itself around us. Whether you're easing into sleep or simply seeking a soft pause from the day, I'm grateful to be part of your routine. Before we embark on this journey through salt-stained workshops and timber yards that reeked of sweat and ambition, I'm curious to know where in the world you're listening from right now. Are you perhaps near a harbour yourself, watching modern vessels glide past, while we explore the back-breaking world of their ancient predecessors? Drop a comment below and let me know what time it is where you are. Whether you're winding down after a long day or just beginning your morning, I'm grateful you've chosen to spend this time learning about the forgotten heroes who built the ships that shaped our world. And if you find yourself drawn to these tales of maritime craftsmanship and human endurance, consider subscribing so you never miss an episode of these deep dives into history's most demanding professions. There's something profoundly humbling about understanding the sheer physical and mental toll required to master trades that our ancestors took for granted. Trades that literally kept civilizations afloat. Now settle in as we transport ourselves to an era when the construction of a single ship could consume years of a craftsman's life, when entire communities revolved around the rhythmic sounds of shipyards, and when the skills passed down from father to son represented not just a livelihood, but a sacred trust between those who built and those who would sail. The life of an ancient shipbuilder was a relentless battle against time, tide, and the unforgiving nature of wood and sea. These weren't mere carpenters or casual labourers, but master craftsmen whose expertise had been honed through decades of apprenticeship under the most demanding conditions imaginable. From the moment they could grip a tool, young boys destined for shipbuilding were thrust into a world where precision meant survival, and where the slightest miscalculation could doom an entire crew to watery graves. Consider the sheer physical demands of their daily existence. Before the sun had fully risen, these craftsmen would already be at work in shipyards that stretched along coastlines from the Mediterranean to the North Sea. Their hands, permanently stained with pitch and scarred from countless encounters with rough timber and sharp tools, would grip adzes and axes that felt like extensions of their own bodies. The weight of these implements, swung thousands of times each day, gradually sculpted their frames into powerful, asymmetrical forms where one arm grew notably larger than the other from the constant repetitive motion. The timber itself presented challenges that modern builders can scarcely imagine. Ancient shipbuilders worked primarily with green wood, freshly felled trees that still carried the moisture and weight of living timber. A single oak beam destined for a ship's keel could weigh several tons, requiring teams of men to maneuver it into position, using nothing more than ropes, pulleys, and raw human strength. The physical toll of wrestling these massive timbers day after day left most shipbuilders with backs that ached constantly and joints that creaked like the very vessels they constructed. But the physical demands were only part of the story. The mental pressure faced by ancient shipbuilders was equally crushing. Unlike modern construction where blueprints and precise measurements guide every step, these craftsmen relied on knowledge passed down through generations, stored entirely in their minds and hands. They had to visualize the completed vessel while working on individual components, understanding how each piece would interact with every other element in a complex three-dimensional puzzle that could span over 100 feet in length. The responsibility weighing on their shoulders was immense. They knew that merchants would load these vessels with precious cargo worth fortunes, that families would crowd aboard seeking new lives in distant lands, and that naval commanders would stake their reputations and the fate of their nations on the seaworthiness of these wooden giants. A single weak joint, a poorly fitted plank, or an incorrectly calculated curve could result in catastrophic failure hundreds of miles from shore, condemning everyone aboard to certain death. The working conditions in ancient shipyards were nothing short of brutal. Imagine labouring under the scorching Mediterranean sun with no protection, save perhaps a wide-brimmed hat, the heat radiating off sun-baked timber, making the air shimmer like a furnace. Or picture the bone-chilling dampness of northern European yards, where fog rolled in from the sea, penetrating wool clothing and settling into joints already aching from the previous day's exertions. Rain turned work sites into treacherous quagmires of mud and sawdust. Yet the work continued regardless of weather, driven by the urgent demands of trade and warfare. The tools available to ancient shipbuilders were deceptively simple, yet required extraordinary skill to master. The adze, perhaps the most iconic of shipbuilding implements, demanded years of practice to wield effectively. This curved blade attached to a short handle could shape the most complex curves when guided by an expert hand, but in the grip of a novice, it was more likely to remove fingers than create smooth planking. Master shipbuilders could work with an adze for hours, their movements flowing in a hypnotic rhythm that gradually revealed the hidden shape within rough timber. The saw, too, was a far cry from modern power tools. Ancient crosscut saws required two men working in perfect synchronization, one pushing while the other pulled, maintaining steady pressure and angle to achieve straight cuts through massive timbers. The physical coordination required was extraordinary, as any deviation from perfect teamwork would bind the blade or create irregular cuts that would compromise the vessel's integrity. These men developed an almost telepathic understanding of their partner's movements, breathing in unison as they worked through logs that might take hours to section. Measuring and marking required skills that bordered on the mystical. Without modern instruments, shipbuilders relied on simple tools like dividers, squares, and plumb lines, combined with an intuitive understanding of proportion and geometry that took decades to develop. They could look at a curved piece of timber and know instinctively how to mark it for cutting to achieve the exact shape needed for a specific position in the hull. This spatial intelligence was perhaps their most valuable asset, impossible to teach directly, and only acquired through years of observation and practice. The hierarchy within shipbuilding crews was as rigid as it was necessary. At the top stood the master builder, a craftsman whose reputation had been earned through decades of successful projects. These men commanded respect that bordered on reverence, for their decisions would determine not only the success of the current project, but the survival of future crews. Beneath them worked the journeymen, skilled craftsmen who had completed their apprenticeships but had not yet achieved the status to lead major projects. At the bottom of the ladder were the apprentices, boys and young men who endured years of menial tasks and harsh treatment in exchange for the gradual acquisition of skills that might eventually elevate them to positions of responsibility. The apprenticeship system was particularly brutal, designed to weed out all but the most dedicated and naturally gifted candidates. Young apprentices might spend their first year doing nothing but hauling water, gathering wood chips, and maintaining tools, all while observing the work of their superiors and absorbing lessons through osmosis. The physical abuse was often severe, with masters believing that harsh treatment would toughen boys for the demanding life ahead. Many apprentices suffered injuries that would mark them for life, the price of learning trades where a moment's inattention could result in serious harm. Yet for those who persevered, the rewards could be substantial. Master shipbuilders occupied positions of genuine importance in ancient societies, their skills essential for trade, exploration, and military success. They often accumulated significant wealth, owning properties and commanding fees that reflected their irreplaceable expertise. Some achieved fame that extended far beyond their local communities, their reputations spreading wherever ships carried news of exceptional vessels that had weathered storms or outpaced competitors. The social dynamics within shipyards created unique communities bound together by shared hardship and mutual dependence. These men developed bonds forged in the crucible of dangerous, demanding work relationships that often lasted entire lifetimes. They created their own traditions, rituals, and superstitions, passing down not just technical knowledge, but cultural practices that helped them cope with the psychological pressures of their profession. The seasonal nature of shipbuilding added another layer of complexity to their lives. Winter months in northern climates often brought construction to a halt, forcing craftsmen to find alternative employment or subsist on savings accumulated during productive seasons. This uncertainty created constant financial pressure, as shipbuilders could never be entirely sure when their next major project would begin or how long it might last. The evolution of shipbuilding techniques over centuries meant that craftsmen had to constantly adapt and learn new methods. Those who clung too rigidly to traditional approaches might find themselves obsolete as innovations spread through maritime communities. The most successful shipbuilders were those who could balance respect for proven methods with openness to improvements, a delicate balancing act that required both humility and confidence. The relationship between shipbuilders and their clients was often fraught with tension. Merchants and naval commanders frequently demanded impossible combinations of speed, capacity, and cost savings, forcing craftsmen to make difficult compromises that could affect the vessel's performance or safety. The political dimensions of major shipbuilding projects added additional pressure, as delays or cost overruns could have serious consequences for both the builders and their patrons. Regional variations in shipbuilding techniques created distinct traditions that reflected local conditions and cultural preferences. Mediterranean builders developed methods suited to relatively calm waters and specific types of cargo, while their northern European counterparts faced the challenge of creating vessels capable of surviving Atlantic storms. These regional differences meant that master builders who traveled between areas had to adapt their techniques to local expectations and materials. The procurement and preparation of materials represented a massive logistical challenge that often fell partially on the shipbuilders themselves. They needed to understand not just how to work with different types of wood, but where to find the best timber, how to season it properly, and how to transport it to the construction site. The relationship between builders and suppliers was crucial, as access to quality materials could make or break a project. The launching of a completed vessel represented the culmination of months or years of intense labor. But it also marked a moment of profound anxiety for the builders. This was when their work would be tested by the unforgiving sea, when all their calculations and craftsmanship would either prove successful or reveal fatal flaws. The ceremony surrounding ship launches reflected both celebration and apprehension, as communities gathered to witness the moment when human skill met natural forces. The legacy of ancient shipbuilders extends far beyond the vessels they created. Their innovations in joinery, their understanding of structural engineering, and their development of production techniques influenced construction methods across many trades. The organizational systems they developed for managing large, complex projects provided models that would be adapted for other types of construction throughout history. The environmental impact of ancient shipbuilding was enormous, as the construction of large vessels required vast quantities of timber from increasingly distant forests. This demand drove deforestation across much of Europe and the Mediterranean, fundamentally altering landscapes and ecosystems. Shipbuilders were often caught between the immediate demands of their craft and the long-term consequences of resource depletion. The preservation of shipbuilding knowledge faced constant challenges as political upheavals, economic disruptions, and changing technologies threatened to break the chains of transmission from master to apprentice. Some techniques were lost entirely when communities of builders were displaced or when economic conditions made their specializations obsolete. The international nature of maritime trade meant that shipbuilders were among the first craftsmen to encounter and adapt foreign techniques. This cross-cultural exchange accelerated innovation, but also created confusion as different traditions merged and conflicted. The most successful builders were often those who could synthesize diverse approaches into coherent new methods. The spiritual and superstitious aspects of shipbuilding reflected the deep anxiety that surrounded these projects. Builders developed elaborate rituals designed to ensure the success and safety of their vessels, from the selection of timber to the placement of symbolic objects within the hull. These practices provided psychological comfort in a profession where the consequences of failure were so severe. The transition from ancient to medieval shipbuilding techniques marked the end of an era for traditional craftsmen. New tools, materials, and organizational methods gradually transformed the trade, requiring veteran builders to adapt or face obsolescence. This period of change was particularly difficult for older craftsmen who had spent decades perfecting techniques that were suddenly considered outdated. The stories of individual shipbuilders, when they survive in historical records, reveal the human drama behind these massive construction projects. Tales of innovative solutions to technical problems, of conflicts between craftsmen and their patrons, and of vessels that exceeded or disappointed expectations, provide glimpses into the daily realities of this demanding profession. The economic impact of shipbuilding extended far beyond the immediate participants, supporting entire networks of suppliers, transporters, and service providers. The prosperity of many coastal communities depended heavily on the success of local shipyards, creating symbiotic relationships that could persist for generations or collapse suddenly when major projects ended. The military applications of shipbuilding added layers of secrecy and urgency that further complicated an already demanding profession. Naval vessels required specialized knowledge and often had to be completed under tight deadlines driven by strategic necessities. The builders of warships carried additional responsibility, knowing that the fate of nations might depend on their craftsmanship. The aesthetic dimensions of ship construction reveal another aspect of the builder's expertise. While functionality was paramount, successful vessels also needed to project power, wealth, or cultural sophistication through their appearance. This required shipbuilders to master decorative techniques in addition to their structural skills, adding artistic expression to their already comprehensive repertoire. The documentation and transmission of shipbuilding knowledge evolved slowly from purely oral traditions to written records, reflecting broader changes in literacy and information management. The earliest technical manuals represented revolutionary attempts to codify knowledge that had previously existed only in the minds and hands of master craftsmen. The gender dynamics of ancient shipbuilding were complex, with women generally excluded from the primary construction work, but often playing crucial supporting roles in the broader industry. Understanding these relationships provides insight into the social structures that surrounded and supported this male-dominated craft. The geographic spread of shipbuilding techniques reveals patterns of cultural exchange and technological diffusion that illuminate broader historical processes. The movement of craftsmen between regions, driven by economic opportunities or political disruptions, served as a crucial mechanism for the spread of innovation. The psychological toll of shipbuilding work extended beyond the physical demands to include the constant pressure of responsibility and the trauma of witnessing failures. The mental health of craftsmen who had devoted their lives to this demanding profession was often precarious, particularly in later years when physical capabilities declined, but financial needs remained pressing. The relationship between shipbuilding and other crafts created networks of interdependence that shaped entire regional economies. Rope makers, sailmakers, blacksmiths, and other specialists all depended on the success of shipbuilding projects, creating complex webs of economic relationship that could amplify both prosperity and hardship. The seasonal rhythms of shipbuilding work created unique lifestyle patterns that distinguish these craftsmen from other trades. The intensity of work during construction seasons, followed by periods of relative inactivity, required different approaches to financial planning, family life, and personal development. The technological limitations of ancient tools and techniques meant that shipbuilders had to develop extraordinary sensitivity to the properties of their materials. They learned to read the grain of wood, to understand how different species would behave under stress, and to predict how their constructions would age and change over time. The competitive dynamics between different shipbuilding communities drove innovation, but also created tensions that could escalate into serious conflicts. The theft of trade secrets, the poaching of skilled craftsmen, and disputes over contracts all reflected the high stakes involved in this crucial industry. The role of shipbuilding in exploration and discovery gave these craftsmen indirect influence over some of history's most significant developments. The apprenticeship system served as the backbone of shipbuilding knowledge in ancient times, yet it demanded extraordinary sacrifices from those who dared enter its ranks. Young boys, often no older than 7 or 8, were torn from their families and thrust into a world where their survival depended entirely on their ability to endure punishment and absorb lessons through pain and repetition. These apprentices faced a brutal initiation that would break many modern souls. Dawn brought no gentle awakening, but rather the sharp crack of a master's rod against sleeping forms. Before the sun had fully risen, these children found themselves hauling massive timbers across shipyard grounds, their small hands already beginning to blister and crack from the rough wood and coarse ropes. The master shipwrights showed no mercy to these young charges. A mistake in measuring could result in a severe beating. Dropping a valuable tool might mean going without food for an entire day. The philosophy was simple, yet merciless. Pain would teach what words could not, and only through suffering would these boys develop the instincts necessary to survive in such a dangerous profession. Consider the daily routine that these apprentices endured. Before dawn, they would rise to prepare the workshop, lighting fires, organizing tools, and hauling water from distant wells. Their breakfast, if they received one at all, consisted of stale bread and perhaps a thin gruel. Then began the real work, learning to shape wood through observation and mimicry, their young bodies straining against materials that seemed impossibly heavy and unwieldy. The master craftsman believed that the hands must learn before the mind could understand. Apprentices spent countless hours simply feeling different types of wood, learning to identify the subtle variations in grain and texture that would determine a timber's suitability for different parts of a vessel. Cedar for planking, oak for frames, pine for masts. Each wood demanded different techniques, different tools, different approaches. But the physical demands were only part of the ordeal. These young apprentices also faced psychological challenges that would test their very sanity. The isolation from family, the constant criticism from masters who seemed impossible to please, and the overwhelming responsibility of learning skills that could mean the difference between life and death for future sailors, all weighed heavily on their developing minds. Many apprentices never completed their training. Some fled in the night, unable to bear another day of punishment and exhaustion. Others suffered injuries that ended their careers before they truly began. Crushed fingers, broken bones, or worse. The shipyards were littered with the dreams of boys who simply could not endure the relentless demands of their chosen craft. Yet for those who persevered, who somehow found the strength to continue despite every instinct screaming at them to run, a transformation gradually occurred. Their hands, once soft and clumsy, became tools of precision and power. Their eyes learned to see imperfections invisible to the untrained observer. Their bodies, hardened by years of punishment, could work from dawn to dusk without faltering. The relationship between master and apprentice was complex and often contradictory. While masters were quick to punish mistakes, they also understood that each apprentice represented the future of their craft. A master's reputation depended partly on the quality of the craftsman he produced. This created a strange dynamic where brutal treatment existed alongside genuine concern for the apprentice's development. The social isolation experienced by these young apprentices cannot be understated. Removed from their families at such tender ages, they formed intense bonds with their fellow apprentices that often lasted their entire lives. These relationships became their new family, their source of emotional support in a world that seemed designed to crush their spirits. The learning process itself was shrouded in mystery and tradition. Masters guarded their secrets jealously, revealing techniques only when they deemed an apprentice ready. This created an atmosphere of constant uncertainty, where apprentices never knew when they might be trusted with more advanced knowledge or when they might face another test of their worthiness. The tools of the trade became extensions of the apprentices' bodies through years of repetitive use. Each adze, each saw, each measuring device had its own personality and required its own approach. Learning to work with these tools was like learning a complex language where every gesture had meaning and every mistake carried consequences. The progression from apprentice to journeyman was marked by increasingly difficult challenges. Masters would assign tasks that seemed impossible, watching carefully to see how their charges responded to pressure and failure. The ability to remain calm under stress, to find creative solutions to seemingly insurmountable problems, and to maintain quality standards even when exhausted became the true measures of an apprentice's potential. The knowledge transmitted through this system went far beyond simple woodworking techniques. Apprentices learned to read the weather, to understand the behavior of different woods under stress, to calculate loads and stresses, and to work as part of a team where every member's life might depend on the other's competence. This apprenticeship system, brutal as it was, created craftsmen whose skills were legendary throughout the ancient world. Their ships could withstand storms that would destroy lesser vessels. Their joints held firm under stresses that would tear apart inferior construction. And their understanding of their craft reached levels that bordered on the mystical. The psychological toll of this training system extended far beyond the apprenticeship years. Many master craftsmen bore the emotional scars of their early training throughout their lives, perpetuating cycles of harsh treatment that they themselves had endured. The forest was alive with the sound of axes biting into timber as the dawn mist clung to the ancient oaks. For the shipwrights of medieval Scotland, this was where their world began. Not in the harbour where the finished vessels would one day slice through dark waters, but here among the towering trees that would become their raw material. The selection of timber was perhaps the most critical decision these master craftsmen would make, for a ship was only as strong as the wood from which it was born. Oak was the king of shipbuilding timber, its dense grain and natural resistance to rot making it the backbone of every worthy vessel. But not just any oak would suffice. The shipwrights sought trees that had grown slowly, their rings tight and even, their heartwood dark with age and strength. They would run their weathered hands along the bark, feeling for the subtle signs that marked a tree destined for greatness. A slight curve in the trunk might become the perfect knee for joining hull to deck. A branch growing at just the right angle could be shaped into the ribs that would cradle cargo and crew alike. The felling of these giants was a ritual in itself, timed with the phases of the moon and the turning of the seasons. Winter timber, cut when the sap ran low, was prized above all else. The shipwrights would arrive before first light, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air as they prepared their tools. The great two-handed saws, their teeth filed to razor sharpness, would sing through the wood with a rhythm that echoed through the forest like a heartbeat. But timber selection went far beyond simply choosing the largest trees. Each part of a ship demanded its own specific type of wood. The keel, that mighty spine upon which everything else depended, required the straightest, strongest oak trunk the forest could provide. For the planking that would form the hull, shipwrights sought wood with a natural flexibility, timber that could bend without breaking as the vessel rode the swells. Pine and fir, with their long straight trunks and resistance to splitting, were prized for masts and spars. The ancient shipwrights possessed an almost mystical understanding of wood, passed down through generations like sacred knowledge. They could read the grain like text, understanding how the forces of wind and water would stress each piece. They knew that timber cut from the north side of a tree was denser and stronger, having faced the harshest weather. They understood that wood from trees grown on rocky soil would be harder and more durable than that from rich valley earth. Once felled, the timber began a journey that could span years before it ever saw the inside of a shipyard. The logs were hauled from the forest by teams of oxen, their massive weight leaving deep ruts in the earth that would remain for seasons to come. At the timber yards, the wood was carefully sorted and stacked, each piece marked with cryptic symbols that told the shipwrights everything they needed to know about its origin and intended purpose. The seasoning process was perhaps the most crucial and least understood aspect of medieval shipbuilding. Green timber, fresh from the forest, was filled with moisture that would cause it to warp and crack as it dried. So the logs were stacked in great piles, separated by wooden spaces that allowed air to flow between them. For months, sometimes years, they would remain there, slowly giving up their moisture to the wind and sun. The master shipwrights could tell, just by looking at a piece of timber, how long it had been seasoning. They would tap it with their knuckles, listening to the tone it produced. Green wood gave a dull thud, while properly seasoned timber rang like a bell. They would examine the ends of the logs, watching for the fine cracks that appeared as the wood dried, signs that told them whether the seasoning was proceeding correctly, or if a piece was destined to split and become useless. During this long waiting period, the timber was not simply left to its own devices. It was turned regularly to ensure even drying, and the shipwrights would inspect each piece for signs of rot, insect damage, or other defects that might render it unsuitable for shipbuilding. Pieces that showed promise were moved to covered sheds where they could be protected from rain while still allowing air circulation. The tools used for working this precious timber were marvels of medieval craftsmanship in their own right. The shipwright's adze, with its curved blade set perpendicular to the handle, was the primary tool for shaping timber. In skilled hands, it could remove wood with surgical precision, following the natural grain to create surfaces smoother than anything achievable with a saw. The broad axe, its blade offset to one side, was used for squaring timbers and creating flat surfaces. Draw knives, with handles at both ends of a curved blade, were pulled toward the craftsman to shape smaller pieces and create the fine curves that would make a hull both beautiful and seaworthy. Each tool was not merely an implement, but an extension of the craftsman's will, honed and maintained with religious devotion. The sharpening of blades was a daily ritual, performed with whetstones that had been in families for generations. The handles were shaped to fit each individual's grip, worn smooth by countless hours of use. A master shipwright's tools were often passed down from father to son, carrying with them not just their physical properties, but the accumulated wisdom of generations. The preparation of timber for use required skills that bordered on the supernatural. Shipwrights could look at a rough log and envision the finished piece it would become, seeing through the bark and sapwood to the perfect plank hidden within. They understood how to work with the grain rather than against it, following the natural lines of strength that ran through the wood like veins of gold through ore. The process of converting logs into usable timber was laborious beyond modern comprehension. Every cut was made by hand, every surface shaped with muscle and sweat. Pit sawing, where one man stood atop a log while another worked in a pit below, was perhaps the most grueling task in the entire shipyard. The two-man saw, sometimes 12 feet in length, had to be pulled and pushed in perfect rhythm, following chalk lines marked on the timber with mathematical precision. The sawyer above, called the top dog, had the responsibility of keeping the saw straight and true, reading the grain of the wood, and adjusting the cut accordingly. Below, in the pit filled with sawdust and the constant rain of wood chips, the bottom sawyer or pitman endured conditions that were barely tolerable. The work was so demanding that shifts were kept short, and even the strongest men could only manage a few hours at a time. As the timber was shaped and prepared, the shipwrights began to see their vessel taking form in their minds. Each piece was not just a component, but a vital organ in a living creature that would one day brave the fury of the North Sea. The process of selecting and preparing timber was not simply about gathering materials. It was about breathing life into dead wood, transforming the giants of the forest into the bones and sinews of something that would dance with wind and wave. The apprentices watched this transformation with wonder and growing understanding. They learned that a ship was not built, but rather revealed, carved from the timber, like a sculptor reveals the statue hidden within the marble. They began to understand that their craft was not about imposing their will upon the wood, but about discovering what each piece wanted to become and helping it achieve that destiny. The relationship between shipwright and timber was intimate and profound. These craftsmen spent their lives surrounded by wood in all its forms, from the living trees in the forest to the finished planks of a completed hull. They could tell the species of a tree by the sound it made when struck, identify its origin by the pattern of its grain, and predict its behavior under stress by the way it felt beneath their hands. This deep connection with their material was born of necessity as much as tradition. In an age before scientific testing and engineering calculations, the shipwright's intuitive understanding of wood was often the only thing standing between a successful voyage and catastrophic failure. They carried within their minds a vast library of knowledge about how different timbers would behave in different situations. Wisdom accumulated through generations of trial and error, success and tragedy. The preparation of specialized pieces required even greater skill and understanding. The great knees that would connect the ribs to the deck beams had to be cut from the natural joints where trunk met branch, preserving the unbroken grain that gave them their strength. Finding timber with the right curves and angles was like searching for treasure, and when such pieces were discovered, they were guarded jealously and saved for the most critical applications. The stem and stern posts, those mighty timbers that would form the bow and stern of the vessel, demanded trees of extraordinary size and quality. These pieces would bear enormous stresses as the ship worked in heavy seas, and any weakness could prove catastrophic. The selection of these critical components might take months, as the shipwrights searched through their carefully hoarded stock for pieces worthy of such important roles. As winter gave way to spring, and the timber continued its slow transformation, from forest giant to ship component, the shipyard began to take on the organized chaos that marked the beginning of a new vessel. The timber, now properly seasoned and sorted, was arranged according to the master's plan, each piece waiting for its moment to join the growing structure. The apprentices, who had spent months learning to read wood and understand its properties, now began the next phase of their education. They would learn to shape these carefully selected timbers, to join them with precision and artistry, and to see in their work not just a collection of wooden pieces, but the beginnings of something magnificent, a vessel that would carry the hopes and dreams of those who sailed in her across the treacherous waters of the medieval world. The ancient knowledge of timber selection and preparation was more than just technical skill. It was a form of communion with the natural world that has been largely lost to our modern age. These medieval craftsmen understood that they were not masters of their material, but partners with it, working together to create something greater than either could achieve alone. In their hands, the trees of the Scottish forests were transformed from mere timber into the very essence of maritime adventure, ready to face whatever challenges the sea might offer. The process of transforming these carefully selected and prepared timbers into the framework of a ship was about to begin. and with it, the next chapter in the epic story of medieval shipbuilding. But that transformation would require not just skill and knowledge, but a level of precision and artistry that would test every aspect of the shipwright's craft. The grinding labour of ancient shipbuilding never ceased, even as the last planks were fitted to the hull and the final iron fastenings hammered into place. For the master craftsmen and their weathered apprentices, the completion of one vessel merely signalled the beginning of another endless cycle of toil. But perhaps no aspect of their craft demanded more specialised knowledge and back-breaking effort than the creation of the ship's rigging and the intricate network of ropes, pulleys, and sails that would harness the wind's power. The rope makers who served the shipyards occupied a unique position in the maritime hierarchy. These skilled artisans possessed knowledge passed down through generations, understanding how to twist and weave fibres into cordage strong enough to withstand the tremendous forces of wind and wave. Their workshops, long narrow buildings, stretching hundreds of feet in length, echoed with the rhythmic creaking of rope walks, where hemp fibres were spun into the lifelines of seafaring vessels. Hemp cultivation itself represented another layer of the shipbuilding enterprise, requiring vast fields and careful tending to produce the raw material for rigging. Farmers dedicated entire seasons to growing and processing these crucial fibres, their hands permanently stained with the oils and resins that would eventually find their way into the ship's cordage. The harvesting process alone demanded precise timing, as hemp cut too early lacked strength, while hemp left too long became brittle and unreliable. In the rope walks, apprentice rope makers began their training by learning to hackle the raw hemp, combing out impurities and aligning the fibres with iron-toothed tools that could easily slice through flesh if handled carelessly. Their fingers grew calloused from the constant friction, and their lungs filled with hemp dust that would plague many with persistent coughs throughout their lives. Yet they persevered, knowing that mastery of their craft meant the difference between a ship that could weather the fiercest storms and one that would founder at the first sign of rough seas. The actual process of rope making required extraordinary coordination and endurance. Teams of rope makers would walk backwards for hundreds of yards, carefully feeding and twisting the hemp fibres as they moved. The lead rope maker, known as the spinner, bore the greatest responsibility, controlling the tension and twist that determined the rope's ultimate strength and flexibility. A single mistake in judgment could result in weak spots that might fail catastrophically when lives depended on the rigging's integrity. Different types of cordage serve specific purposes aboard ship, each requiring its own particular blend of materials and construction techniques. Standing rigging, which supported the masts and remained relatively static, demanded the strongest possible construction, often incorporating tar and other preservatives to resist the corrosive effects of salt spray. Running rigging, used to adjust sails and control the ship's movement, needed to be more flexible while still maintaining considerable strength. The master rope maker had to understand these subtle distinctions and adjust his methods accordingly. The creation of ship's cables represented the pinnacle of the rope maker's art. These massive hawsers, sometimes measuring over a foot in circumference, required the coordinated efforts of dozens of workers and could take weeks to complete. The process began with the careful selection of the finest hemp, which was then spun into yarns of precise thickness and consistency. These yarns were twisted together to form strands, and the strands were finally laid together to create the finished cable. The tension and rhythm of this work created a unique culture among the rope makers. Songs and chants helped coordinate their movements, while experienced craftsmen shared knowledge about reading the hemp's quality and adjusting techniques for different weather conditions. The work was physically demanding in ways that modern observers can barely comprehend, requiring constant walking, lifting, and manipulation of heavy materials while maintaining perfect coordination with fellow workers. Quality control in rope making involved tests that could mean the difference between life and death for sailors. Master rope makers developed an almost supernatural ability to assess rope strength through touch and observation, detecting flaws that might not become apparent until the cordage faced the ultimate test of a storm at sea. They would stretch test samples, examine the lay of the strands, and even taste the hemp to ensure proper curing and preparation. The treatment and preservation of finished rope required additional expertise and labor. Coating with tar not only protected against rot and marine borers, but also required careful application to avoid making the rope too stiff for proper use. Workers spent long hours in tar-filled environments, their skin and clothing permanently blackened by the substance that was both essential for preservation and slowly poisonous to those who worked with it daily. Beyond the basic cordage, shipbuilders required an enormous variety of specialized rigging components. Blockmakers carved and assembled the wooden shells that housed the pulleys, carefully selecting woods that could withstand constant friction and stress. The sheaves within these blocks demanded precise fitting and regular maintenance, as any binding or irregularity could make sail handling difficult or dangerous. Iron workers contributed their own specialized knowledge to the rigging's creation, forging the chains, anchors, and metal fittings that connected rope to wood and provided the crucial link between the ship's structure and its sail plan. These components had to be both incredibly strong and carefully shaped to avoid chafing or weakening the cordage that passed through or around them. The sailmakers represented another guild within the shipbuilding community, transforming vast quantities of canvas into the wing-like surfaces that would capture the wind's energy. Their workshops resembled enormous tailoring establishments, with craftsmen bent over massive pieces of fabric, stitching with techniques that had evolved over centuries of trial and error. The patterns they cut and the seams they sewed had to account for the tremendous stresses that wind would place on the finished sails. Canvas preparation began with the weaving process itself, as specialized weavers created cloth of the precise weight and weave pattern required for different types of sails. Heavier canvas served for working sails that faced constant use, while lighter fabrics might be reserved for fair weather or specialized purposes. The flax used in canvas production required its own cultivation and processing, adding yet another layer to the complex web of skills and trades that supported shipbuilding. The cutting of sail patterns demanded mathematical precision, combined with intuitive understanding of how fabric would behave under stress. Master sailmakers developed templates and techniques passed down through generations, adjusting for the specific requirements of different ship types and sailing conditions. A mistake in cutting could result in sails that set poorly or failed prematurely, potentially dooming a voyage before it began. Stitching techniques in sailmaking had evolved to create seams stronger than the fabric itself. Double and triple rows of stitching, reinforced with leather patches at stress points, created sail structures capable of withstanding forces that could easily tear apart less carefully constructed fabric. The thread used for this stitching required its own specialized preparation, often waxed or treated to resist the effects of salt water and constant flexing. The installation of grommets, reef points, and other hardware in finished sails required additional skills and tools. Each hole punched in the fabric had to be carefully reinforced to prevent tearing, while the spacing and placement of these features determined how effectively sailors could handle the sails in various weather conditions. The sailmaker's understanding of practical seamanship was as important as his technical skills with needle and thread. Apprentice sailmakers began their training by learning to sew straight seams on scraps of old canvas, gradually progressing to more complex tasks as their skills developed. The physical demands of the work were considerable, as sailmakers spent long hours bent over their work in positions that strained backs and necks. The constant manipulation of heavy, stiff canvas left their hands raw and their fingers permanently curved from gripping needles and thread. The coordination between rope makers, sailmakers, and shipwrights required careful planning and communication. Rigging plans had to be developed that matched the sail plan to the ship's structure and the available cordage. Changes in one element might necessitate adjustments throughout the entire system, requiring craftsmen to adapt their work to accommodate the needs of other trades. Seasonal considerations affected every aspect of rigging preparation. Hemp harvested at different times of year possessed varying qualities, while weather conditions during rope making could dramatically affect the final product. Sailmakers had to account for how canvas might shrink or stretch with changes in humidity, while the installation of rigging aboard ship had to be timed to avoid damage from winter weather. The testing and adjustment of completed rigging represented a crucial phase in the shipbuilding process. Master riggers would carefully examine every line and fitting, adjusting tension and alignment to ensure optimal performance. This process often revealed weaknesses or design flaws that required immediate correction, adding time and expense to projects already stretched by the enormous complexity of the work. The economic impact of rigging work extended far beyond the immediate costs of materials and labour. A ship's rigging represented a significant portion of its total value, and the quality of this work directly affected the vessel's earning potential throughout its service life. Merchants and ship owners understood that investing in superior rigging could mean the difference between profitable voyages and costly repairs or losses at sea. The social structure within rigging trades reflected the broader hierarchies of medieval and early modern society. Master craftsmen jealously guarded their most valuable techniques, passing knowledge to apprentices only after years of faithful service. Guild regulations controlled who could practice these trades and under what circumstances, creating closed communities of skilled workers who maintained their privileged positions through careful control of training and knowledge transfer. The physical toll of rigging work was enormous and cumulative. Rope makers developed characteristic walking gaits from years of backwards movement during rope laying. Sailmakers suffered from eye strain and repetitive motion injuries. The constant exposure to hemp dust, tar, and other materials used in preservation created health problems that shortened lives and reduced the quality of those years. Yet these craftsmen persevered, driven by necessity and the knowledge that their skills were essential to their community's survival and prosperity. The relationship between rigging craftsmen and the broader shipbuilding community was complex and sometimes strained. Delays in rope or sail production could hold up entire shipbuilding projects, creating tension between trades. Competition for the finest materials could lead to conflicts, while the interdependence of different crafts required constant negotiation and compromise. The preservation and storage of rigging materials presented ongoing challenges for shipbuilders. Hemp deteriorated rapidly if not properly stored, while finished rope required careful coiling and protection from moisture and pests. Sails needed regular airing and maintenance to prevent rot and mildew. The investment in proper storage facilities and handling procedures was substantial but absolutely necessary to prevent costly losses. The knowledge required for successful rigging work extended far beyond the mechanical skills of rope making and sail making. Craftsmen had to understand the principles of ship design and naval architecture, the demands of different types of voyages, and the capabilities and limitations of various materials. This broad knowledge base was accumulated over decades of experience and passed down through generations of practitioners. The innovation and improvement of rigging techniques occurred slowly but steadily throughout the age of sail. Craftsmen experimented with new materials, adjusted traditional methods, and developed specialized tools that improved efficiency and quality. These innovations often emerged from the practical experience of dealing with specific problems or challenges, rather than from theoretical considerations. The training of apprentices in rigging trades required enormous patience and commitment from master craftsmen. The complexity of the work meant that achieving competency took many years, during which apprentices provided mostly unskilled labor, while slowly absorbing the knowledge and techniques that would eventually make them valuable craftsmen. The investment in training was substantial. but necessary to maintain the supply of skilled workers required by the shipbuilding industry. As we consider the enormous complexity and physical demands of rigging work, we begin to understand how the creation of sailing ships represented one of humanity's most ambitious technological achievements. The coordination of multiple specialized trades, the accumulation and transfer of technical knowledge, and the sheer physical effort required to transform raw materials into functional sailing systems demanded organizational capabilities and human endurance that seem almost impossible by modern standards. The daily existence of a shipwright in the ancient world was a harsh symphony of sweat, splinters, and unforgiving wood. Picture, if you will, Magnus the shipwright, his weathered hands wrapped around a massive adze as the first light of dawn crept over the harbour. The year was 312 AD, and the scent of pine resin and salt spray filled his nostrils as he began another day that would test every muscle in his body. Magnus had been apprenticed to this trade at the tender age of 7 when his father, a fisherman whose boat had been destroyed in a storm, sold him to Master Theron for 3 silver coins and the promise of a roof over the boy's head. Those early years were nothing short of brutal. His small hands, still soft from childhood, were soon torn and bleeding from handling rough-hewn timber. The other apprentices, desperate to avoid the master's wrath themselves, showed him no mercy, often stealing his meagre rations of barley porridge and forcing him to work longer hours to complete tasks they had deliberately sabotaged. The shipyard itself was a maze of organized chaos. Enormous logs of cedar, oak, and pine lay scattered like the bones of giants, each one requiring careful inspection for the grain patterns that would determine its ultimate use in the vessel. The master shipwrights, their eyes trained by decades of experience, could read wood like philosophers read scrolls, understanding which pieces would bend without breaking, which would hold firm against the relentless pounding of waves, and which were destined to crack under pressure. Every morning before the sun painted the eastern sky, Magnus would join the other workers in the ritual of tool preparation. Their adzes, the curved cutting tools that were extensions of their very souls, required constant sharpening on great whetstones worn smooth by generations of use. The rhythmic scraping of metal on stone created an almost hypnotic cadence that seemed to sync with the heartbeat of the harbour itself. A dull tool was not merely inefficient, it was dangerous, capable of slipping and severing tendons or worse. The hierarchy within the shipyard was as rigid as the social order of the empire itself. At the apex stood the master shipwright, usually a man who had inherited both his position and his jealously guarded secrets from his father. These masters controlled not just the technical aspects of construction, but the very knowledge that made their craft possible. They knew which woods came from which regions, understanding that oak from the northern forests possessed different qualities than oak from southern groves. They could predict how different species would react to salt water, heat, and the constant flexing that came with ocean travel. Beneath the masters were the journeymen, skilled craftsmen who had completed their apprenticeships, but lacked either the capital or the connections to establish their own yards. These men formed the backbone of any major construction project, capable of executing complex joints and understanding the mathematics of hull design. They were the ones who translated the master's vision into reality, measuring and cutting with precision that would be impressive even by modern standards. The apprentices, like young Magnus had been, occupied the lowest rung of this carefully ordered world. Their days began in darkness and ended long after sunset, filled with the most back-breaking and monotonous tasks. They hauled timber that often weighed more than they did, their shoulders developing distinctive calluses from the constant pressure of heavy beams. They mixed the various substances used to seal and protect the wood, stirring great vats of pine pitch until their arms screamed in protest. The smell of these materials permeated their clothes, their hair, their very skin, marking them as surely as any brand. But it was the selection and preparation of timber that truly separated the master craftsmen from mere labourers. The process began not in the shipyard, but in distant forests, where trees were chosen with the care of a jeweller selecting precious stones. The ideal ship timber came from trees that had grown slowly in harsh conditions, their wood dense and strong from years of fighting wind and weather. Foresters, working closely with the shipwrights, would mark trees years before they were needed, allowing them to season naturally while still standing. When the time came for harvest, the cutting had to be done at precisely the right moment. Different phases of the moon were believed to affect the quality of the wood, with most masters insisting that trees cut during the waning moon would be less prone to decay and insect damage. The actual felling was a ceremony in itself, with offerings made to forest spirits and careful attention paid to the direction of the fall to prevent the valuable wood from splitting on impact. Once felled, the logs faced a journey that could span continents. River systems became highways for massive rafts of timber, with skilled log drivers guiding them through rapids and around obstacles that could destroy months of work in seconds. Magnus had heard tales of entire seasons' worth of carefully selected wood disappearing beneath the waters when a raft broke apart in turbulent currents, leaving shipyards empty and workers without employment. The seasoning process, once the logs reached the yard, was perhaps the most critical and least understood aspect of the entire enterprise. Green wood, fresh from the forest, contained vast amounts of moisture that had to be slowly and carefully removed. Too rapid drying would cause checking and splitting that could render even the finest timber useless. Too slow, and rot would set in, turning solid wood into spongy, worthless material. Master shipwrights developed elaborate systems for seasoning their wood, some involving partially burying logs in sand, others constructing special sheds with carefully controlled airflow. The process could take years, requiring constant monitoring and adjustment. Magnus learned to read the subtle signs that indicated when wood was ready for use, understanding that the difference between perfectly seasoned timber and wood that was still too green could mean the difference between a seaworthy vessel and a floating disaster. The actual construction began with the laying of the keel, the backbone of the ship that would determine everything that followed. This massive timber, often a single piece hewn from the largest and finest tree available, required incredible precision in its placement. The slightest error at this stage would be magnified throughout the entire vessel, potentially making it impossible to achieve the symmetry essential for proper sailing characteristics. Magnus remembered the first time he was allowed to participate in a keel-laying ceremony. The entire workforce gathered as the master shipwright, aided by his most senior journeyman, carefully positioned the great timber, using techniques passed down through generations. Prayers were offered to Neptune and other sea gods, seeking their blessing for the vessel that would soon take shape. Sacred oils were rubbed into the wood, and small offerings of bread and wine were buried beneath the keel to ensure the ship's good fortune. The construction of the ribs that would give the ship its shape required a completely different set of skills. These curved pieces had to be shaped from naturally bent wood or carefully steamed and formed from straight timber. The steaming process was particularly dangerous work, involving great cauldrons of boiling water and wood that could spring back with lethal force if not properly secured during the bending process. Magnus bore scars on his forearms from pieces that had slipped from their restraints, and he knew shipwrights who had lost fingers or even hands to such accidents. Each rib had to be individually fitted to the keel, a process that required not just technical skill, but an almost artistic understanding of the ship's intended lines. The master shipwright would often work for hours on a single joint, shaving tiny amounts of wood with each pass of his plane until the fit was perfect. There were no second chances with these massive timbers. A piece cut too short was worthless, representing not just wasted material but wasted time and effort. The planking that formed the ship's hull presented its own unique challenges. Each plank had to be shaped to follow the complex curves of the vessel's sides, requiring skills that bordered on sculpture. The wood had to be heated and gradually bent to shape, a process that filled the shipyard with clouds of steam and the constant sound of creaking, protesting timber. Workers developed an almost supernatural ability to predict how far a piece of wood could be bent before it would snap, pushing each plank to its absolute limit without crossing the line into disaster. The joinery techniques used to connect these planks were marvels of engineering that had been refined over centuries of trial and error. Mortise and tenon joints, secured with wooden pegs driven through precisely drilled holes, created connections that were actually stronger than the surrounding wood. The cutting of these joints required tools maintained to razor sharpness and hands steady enough to work to tolerances that would be impressive, even with modern machinery. Magnus learned that the grain of the wood had to be carefully considered for each joint. Pieces cut from the same log could have dramatically different properties, depending on their orientation relative to the tree's growth rings. End grain, while difficult to work, provided incredible strength in compression. Long grain could be bent and shaped, but was vulnerable to splitting along its length. Understanding these properties and using them effectively was what separated master craftsmen from mere workers. The caulking process, which made the difference between a seaworthy vessel and a floating sieve, was an art form in itself. The gaps between planks, carefully measured and maintained during construction, had to be stuffed with oakum, old rope that had been picked apart into individual fibers. This material was driven into the seams using specialized tools and techniques that had to be learned through years of practice. Too little caulking, and the ship would leak catastrophically. Too much, and the planks could be forced apart, creating structural weakness that could prove fatal in heavy weather. The physical toll of this work was devastating. Magnus watched strong men age decades in the span of a few years, their bodies broken by the constant lifting, bending, and straining required by their craft. Backs gave out from years of hauling massive timbers. Joints swelled and stiffened from working in the damp conditions near the harbour. Hands became gnarled claws, permanently shaped by the tools they wielded day after day. Respiratory problems were endemic among shipwrights, caused by years of breathing sawdust, wood shavings, and the various chemicals used in treating timber. The fine particles created by adzes and planes hung in the air like a constant fog, settling in workers' lungs and gradually reducing their capacity for the physical exertion their jobs demanded. Many developed a characteristic cough that marked them as clearly as any guild badge. Eye problems were equally common, caused by the constant strain of working in dim conditions and the frequent exposure to wood chips and splinters. The shipyards provided no protection against flying debris, and workers learned to squint and duck by instinct. Magnus had seen men blinded by splinters that flew from their tools, ending careers in an instant and leaving families destitute. The social structure within the shipbuilding community created its own forms of suffering. Apprentices were essentially indentured servants, bound to their masters for years with no guarantee of fair treatment or adequate training. Many masters viewed their apprentices as nothing more than sources of cheap labour, working them brutally while teaching them as little as possible to extend their period of servitude. Competition between different shipyards could turn vicious, with masters jealously guarding their techniques and actively sabotaging competitors when possible. Magnus heard whispered stories of shipyards where apprentices from rival establishments had disappeared under mysterious circumstances, their bodies sometimes found floating in the harbour weeks later. The knowledge that could make or break a shipyard's reputation was literally worth killing for. The economic pressures facing shipwrights were equally brutal. The cost of quality timber continued to rise as the most accessible forests were depleted, forcing yard owners to source materials from increasingly distant locations. Transportation costs ate into already thin profit margins, and many smaller operations were forced to use inferior wood or compromise on construction techniques to remain competitive. Labor disputes were common and often violent. Workers who attempted to organize for better conditions or higher wages found themselves blacklisted from the industry. Their names circulated among yard owners to ensure they could never find employment in their chosen trade. Strikes were met with immediate replacement by desperate workers willing to accept even worse conditions, creating a cycle of degradation that seemed impossible to break. The seasonal nature of the work created additional hardships. Winter weather made many construction tasks impossible, leaving workers without income for months at a time. Families that had struggled to survive during the working season faced starvation during the idle months. Many shipwrights were forced to seek other employment during the off-season, competing with regular labourers for jobs that paid a fraction of their normal wages. The constant threat of injury or death hung over every worker in the shipyard. The tools necessary for their craft were incredibly dangerous in inexperienced hands, capable of inflicting wounds that could cripple or kill in seconds. The massive timbers they worked with could crush a man without warning if improperly secured. Falls from scaffolding were common and usually fatal, as were accidents involving the various lifting devices used to move heavy materials. Fire was perhaps the greatest fear of any shipwright. The combination of wood shavings, pitch, and open flames created conditions where a small accident could destroy months or years of work in minutes. Magnus remembered the night when a neighbouring shipyard burned to the ground, the flames visible for miles, and the screams of trapped workers haunting the dreams of survivors for years afterward. The yard owner, ruined by the loss, took his own life rather than face his creditors. The knowledge required to build seaworthy vessels was vast and constantly evolving. Understanding wood properties was just the beginning. Shipwrights also had to master the principles of naval architecture, understanding how different hull shapes would perform in various sea conditions. They needed to know metallurgy to work with the iron fittings that secured critical joints. They had to understand the properties of various sealants and treatments that protected their work from the marine environment. Weather prediction became a survival skill for those working on vessels that would face the open ocean. A shipwright who didn't understand how his creation would behave in a storm was essentially signing death warrants for future crews. This knowledge came at a terrible price, learned through observation of wrecks and the testimony of survivors who had experienced the failure of inferior construction firsthand. The apprenticeship system, while providing the only pathway into the trade, was itself a form of institutionalized abuse. Young boys were essentially sold into bondage, with no legal protections against mistreatment and no guarantee that they would actually learn the skills they needed to become independent craftsmen. Many masters deliberately withheld crucial knowledge to extend the apprenticeship period, maximizing their access to cheap labor. The physical demands of the apprenticeship broke many before they could complete their training. Boys who had seemed strong and healthy at age 7 often found themselves unable to continue by their early teens, their bodies already showing the wear that would plague them for the rest of their shortened lives. Those who couldn't complete their apprenticeships faced a future of unskilled labor and poverty, with no compensation for the years they had already invested in the trade. Even those who successfully completed their apprenticeships faced an uncertain future. The transition from apprentice to journeyman required not just technical skill, but political acumen and often substantial financial resources. Many newly minted journeymen found themselves trapped in a cycle of debt to their former masters, working for wages that barely covered their living expenses while struggling to save enough to establish their own operations. The constant exposure to the elements took its own toll on shipyard workers. The harbour environment was harsh and unforgiving, with salt spray corroding tools and equipment, while the combination of sun, wind, and moisture aged workers prematurely. Skin cancer was common among those who worked outdoors for decades, though the condition was poorly understood and rarely treated effectively. The diet available to most shipyard workers was inadequate for the physical demands of their labor, consisting mainly of coarse bread, thin gruel, and occasional scraps of fish or meat. It provided barely enough calories to sustain the massive energy expenditure required by their work. Malnutrition was endemic, leading to a workforce that was constantly operating on the edge of physical collapse. Disease spread rapidly through the crowded, unsanitary conditions of most shipyards. Workers lived in cramped quarters with poor ventilation and no understanding of hygiene. Dysentery, typhoid, and other waterborne illnesses regularly swept through the workforce, killing the weak and leaving survivors even more vulnerable to future outbreaks. The psychological toll of the work was equally devastating. The constant pressure to meet deadlines while maintaining quality standards created stress levels that would be considered unbearable by modern standards. Workers who made mistakes faced not just professional consequences, but often physical punishment that could permanently disable them. The fear of error created a climate of anxiety that pervaded every aspect of shipyard life. Yet despite all these hardships, the shipwrights of the ancient world created vessels that were marvels of engineering and craftsmanship. Their work enabled the exploration and trade that built empires and connected distant civilizations. The techniques they developed through generations of trial and error laid the foundation for all subsequent advances in naval architecture. Magnus, now an old man with hands twisted by arthritis and lungs scarred by decades of breathing sawdust, could look back on a career that had cost him his health, but had given him the satisfaction of creating vessels that had carried explorers to distant shores and merchants to profitable markets. His ships had weathered storms that would have destroyed vessels built by lesser craftsmen, bringing their crews safely home to families who would never know the name of the man whose skill had preserved their lives. The legacy of these ancient shipbuilders lives on in every vessel that takes to the water, their techniques and principles refined, but not fundamentally changed by centuries of technological advancement. They paid the ultimate price for their craft, sacrificing their bodies and often their lives to master skills that would shape the course of human history. The grueling task of forging the future. Yet even as these skilled craftsmen labored to birth these magnificent vessels from raw timber and iron, their work was far from complete. For once the hull was shaped and sealed, once the masts were stepped and the rigging hung, there remained one of the most perilous and demanding phases of ancient shipbuilding, the actual launching and final outfitting of these maritime giants. Picture, if you will, the scene at a bustling shipyard as dawn breaks over the harbour. The air thick with salt spray and the acrid smoke of countless forges, where hundreds of workers converge for what many considered the most treacherous day in the entire shipbuilding process. For months, perhaps years, they had laboured to create this wooden leviathan, and now came the moment of truth. Would their creation survive its first kiss with the sea, or would it crack apart like kindling, sending months of back-breaking work to the bottom of the harbour? The launching process itself was a feat of engineering that would humble modern construction crews. Without the benefit of hydraulic lifts or mechanical cranes, ancient shipwrights relied on an intricate system of wooden rollers, thick ropes, and raw human muscle to coax vessels weighing hundreds of tons from their building cradles into the waiting embrace of the water. Teams of men would position massive tree trunks beneath the hull, each trunk carefully greased with animal fat or soap to reduce friction. The ship would then be slowly, painstakingly rolled toward the water's edge, with dozens of workers manning thick hemp ropes to control the descent. But this was no gentle process. Ships launching too quickly could careen out of control, crushing workers beneath their massive bulk or slamming into harbour walls with devastating force. Too slowly, and the tremendous weight could cause the wooden rollers to snap like twigs, again threatening the lives of anyone unfortunate enough to be caught beneath the shifting mass. Master shipwrights would calculate the precise angle of the launching ramp, factoring in the vessel's weight, the condition of the rollers, and even the state of the tide. A miscalculation could spell disaster not just for the ship, but for the dozens of men whose lives hung in the balance. The psychological toll on the workers was immense. Many had invested years of their lives in the construction of a single vessel, and launching day represented the culmination of all their hopes and fears. Families gathered at the harbour's edge, wives clutching their children as they watched their husbands risk life and limb in service of their craft. The tension was palpable as the great ship began its journey toward the water, creaking and groaning under its own weight, every sound a potential harbinger of catastrophe. Even if the launching proceeded smoothly, the moment the hull touched water brought its own set of terrors. Would the vessel float true? Or would some hidden flaw in the construction cause it to list dangerously to one side? Would the caulking hold? Or would seawater come rushing in through gaps the builders had failed to properly seal? These were the questions that haunted every shipwright as they watched their creation take to the waves for the first time. Once successfully launched, the real work of outfitting began. The hull might be complete, but transforming it into a functional vessel required countless additional man-hours of dangerous specialized labor. Masts had to be stepped, a process that involved hoisting massive wooden poles, weighing several tons into precise vertical positions. This required the coordinated effort of dozens of workers manning an intricate system of pulleys and tackle, with one wrong move capable of sending a mast crashing down onto the deck below. The installation of rigging was perhaps even more treacherous. Workers had to climb to dizzying heights, often in challenging weather conditions, to thread hundreds of feet of rope through blocks and around yards. A single slip could send a man plummeting to his death on the deck far below, while the constant threat of getting caught in the rigging itself presented another mortal danger. The weight of the yards, the horizontal poles from which sails would hang, was enormous, and positioning them required workers to balance precariously on narrow foot ropes while wrestling with unwieldy timbers that could easily crush a man if they shifted unexpectedly. The creation of sails presented its own unique set of challenges. These were not the relatively simple affairs that modern recreational sailors might recognize, but massive pieces of canvas that could stretch for hundreds of square feet. The canvas itself had to be woven by hand, a process that took skilled workers weeks or even months to complete for a single large sail. The material was thick and heavy, requiring tremendous strength to manipulate during the sewing process. Workers would gather in large groups to spread the canvas across the floor of massive lofts, crawling across the surface on hands and knees as they stitched the individual panels together with thick thread. But the physical demands of sailmaking paled in comparison to the health hazards. The canvas was typically treated with various substances to make it more durable and weather-resistant, including tar, linseed oil, and other chemicals that filled the air with toxic fumes. Workers laboured for hours in these noxious environments, their lungs gradually filling with particles that would eventually lead to respiratory ailments and premature death. The repetitive motion of stitching also took its toll, leaving many sailmakers with permanently gnarled hands and chronic pain that would plague them for the rest of their lives. The installation of the completed sails was yet another death-defying endeavour. Teams of workers had to haul these massive pieces of canvas up the masts using a complex system of ropes and pulleys, all while balancing on narrow yards high above the deck. The sails themselves were incredibly heavy when dry, and became even more so when wet, requiring extraordinary strength and coordination to manage safely. A sudden gust of wind could turn a sail into an uncontrollable force, capable of sweeping workers from their perches or entangling them in the rigging with fatal consequences. Even the seemingly simple task of installing the ship's hardware, The countless bolts, cleats, and fittings that would hold everything together required specialized skills and presented constant dangers. Iron fittings had to be heated in forges and shaped while red hot, a process that left many workers with severe burns and scarred hands. The installation itself often required workers to lean over the sides of the vessel or work in cramped spaces below deck, where a single mistake could result in serious injury. The creation of the ship's armament for those vessels intended for warfare added another layer of complexity and danger to the shipbuilding process. Cannons had to be cast, a process that involved pouring molten metal into molds at temperatures that could instantly kill anyone who came too close. The finished guns, weighing several tons each, then had to be transported to the shipyard and somehow maneuvered into position on the vessel's gun decks. This required elaborate systems of ramps, pulleys, and human labor, with the constant risk of a cannon breaking free from its restraints and crushing anyone in its path. The working conditions throughout this entire process were nothing short of appalling by modern standards. Shipyards were chaotic, noisy places where the sound of hammering, sawing, and shouting created a constant din that could permanently damage workers' hearing. The air was thick with sawdust, metal filings, and smoke from the forges, creating respiratory hazards that workers had no choice but to endure. Safety equipment was virtually non-existent. No hard hats, no safety harnesses, no protective eyewear. Workers relied solely on their own skill and vigilance to avoid injury or death. The social hierarchy within the shipyard created additional pressures and dangers for the workers. Master craftsmen, jealous of their status and protective of their trade secrets, often drove their apprentices mercilessly, demanding perfection under impossible conditions. Mistakes were met not with understanding or additional training, but with physical punishment and public humiliation. The pressure to work quickly, particularly when naval contracts carried tight deadlines, led to corner cutting and risk-taking that inevitably resulted in accidents and injuries. Weather added yet another variable to an already dangerous equation. Shipbuilding was largely an outdoor occupation, and work continued regardless of conditions. Rain made wooden surfaces slippery and dangerous, while strong winds could turn routine tasks into life-threatening ordeals. Winter brought its own special miseries, as workers struggled to maintain their grip on tools with numb, frost-bitten fingers, and the risk of hypothermia loomed for anyone who fell into the frigid harbour waters. The economic pressures faced by shipbuilding workers compounded all of these physical dangers. Most were paid by the piece or by the day, meaning that taking time off for illness or injury meant going without income. This created a vicious cycle where workers would return to dangerous jobs before they had fully recovered from previous injuries, increasing their risk of further harm. The seasonal nature of much shipbuilding work also meant that workers had to take whatever jobs were available, regardless of the risks involved. Family life suffered tremendously under these conditions. The long hours and dangerous work meant that many shipbuilders rarely saw their children during daylight hours, and the constant threat of injury or death cast a shadow over every household. Wives lived in perpetual fear that their husbands might not return home at the end of the day, while children grew up understanding that their father's work could claim his life at any moment. Despite these overwhelming challenges, the ancient shipbuilding industry somehow managed to produce vessels of extraordinary quality and durability. The men who laboured in these yards possessed a combination of skill, courage, and determination that allowed them to overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. They developed techniques and traditions that would be passed down through generations, creating a body of knowledge that formed the foundation of maritime technology for centuries to come. The vessels they created would go on to explore unknown oceans, establish trade routes that connected distant civilizations, and fight in naval battles that determined the fate of nations. Every plank that was shaped, every rope that was spliced, every sail that was sewn represented not just technical achievement, but human triumph over adversity. These ships carried within their hulls the sweat, blood, and dreams of the countless workers who had laboured to bring them into being. The legacy of these ancient shipbuilders extends far beyond the vessels they created. Their innovations in construction techniques, their development of specialised tools, and their mastery of complex engineering challenges laid the groundwork for all subsequent advances in maritime technology. The organisational methods they developed for managing large-scale construction projects would influence industrial practices for generations to come. But perhaps most importantly, these workers demonstrated the incredible things that human beings can accomplish when they combine skill with determination and courage with craftsmanship. In an age before modern safety equipment, medical care, or labour protections, they somehow managed to create some of the most complex and beautiful machines ever devised by human hands. Their story is a testament to the power of human ingenuity and the indomitable spirit that drives people to pursue excellence even in the face of overwhelming adversity. As we reflect on the grueling lives of these ancient shipbuilders, we cannot help but be humbled by their sacrifice and inspired by their achievement. They laboured in obscurity, their names forgotten by history, yet their work shaped the course of human civilization. The ancient art of shipbuilding demanded not only the selection and preparation of timber, but the mastery of countless specialised techniques that transformed raw wood into vessels capable of traversing the world's most treacherous waters. As we continue our exploration into the grueling lives of these master craftsmen, we must delve deeper into the intricate processes that consumed their every waking hour and tested the very limits of human endurance. The construction of a ship's hull represented perhaps the most demanding phase of the entire shipbuilding process. Once the massive timbers had been properly seasoned and shaped, the real work began. The shipwright had to possess an almost supernatural understanding of wood grain, stress points, and the complex geometry required to create a vessel that could flex with the waves without breaking apart. Every plank, every beam, every joint had to be precisely calculated and executed, for a single mistake could doom both ship and crew to a watery grave. The process began with laying the keel, the backbone of the ship that would determine its entire character. This massive timber, often hewn from the largest and finest oak available, had to be perfectly straight and true. The master shipwright would spend days examining potential keels, running his weathered hands along the grain, searching for any flaw that might compromise the vessel's integrity. Once selected, the keel was positioned with painstaking precision, using primitive but effective measuring tools and techniques passed down through generations. From this foundation, the shipbuilders would begin the arduous task of raising the ribs, the curved frames that gave the ship its distinctive shape. Each rib had to be individually crafted, steamed into the proper curve, and fitted with microscopic precision. The process of steaming alone was back-breaking work, requiring the constant tending of fires and the careful monitoring of temperature to ensure the wood became pliable without losing its strength. Workers would labour in clouds of scalding steam, their clothes soaked with sweat and condensation, their hands blistered from handling the hot, wet timber. The shaping of these ribs demanded skills that took decades to master. Using only hand tools, the shipwrights had to carve complex curves that would allow the vessel to cut through water efficiently while maintaining structural integrity. A single miscalculation could result in a weak point that would fail under stress, potentially causing catastrophic damage in heavy seas. The pressure on these craftsmen was immense, knowing that lives would depend on their workmanship. As the skeleton of the ship took shape, the planking process began. This was perhaps the most grueling aspect of hull construction, requiring teams of workers to bend and fit each plank with absolute precision. The planks had to be heated, shaped, and forced into position while still hot, a process that demanded perfect timing and coordination. Men would work in pairs, one holding the steaming plank in position, while the other drove in the iron bolts that would secure it permanently to the frame. The physical demands of this work were extraordinary. Each plank could weigh hundreds of pounds and had to be maneuvered into position by human strength alone. Workers would strain against ropes and pulleys, their muscles screaming with effort as they fought to position each piece before it cooled and became rigid. The constant lifting, pulling, and hammering took a devastating toll on their bodies. Many shipbuilders suffered from chronic back problems, joint pain, and repetitive stress injuries that would plague them for the rest of their lives. The caulking process that followed was equally demanding, but required a different set of skills entirely. Every seam between planks had to be stuffed with oakum, tarred rope fibers that would swell when wet to create a watertight seal. This work demanded incredible precision and patience, as poorly caulked seams would leak, potentially sinking the vessel or rotting its timbers from within. Caulkers worked hunched over for hours at a time, driving oakum into seams with mallets and chisels, their backs aching and their hands cramped from the repetitive motions. The tar used in caulking presented its own hazards. Workers were constantly exposed to its toxic fumes, which could cause respiratory problems and skin irritation. The hot tar would splatter and burn exposed skin, leaving permanent scars that marked a shipbuilder as surely as any guild badge. Despite these dangers, the work had to continue, as a ship's life depended on the quality of its caulking. Meanwhile, other specialists laboured on the countless components that would make the vessel functional. The installation of the rudder required extraordinary precision, as this massive steering mechanism had to be perfectly balanced and aligned. The rudder itself was a marvel of engineering. A carefully shaped timber that could weigh several tons, yet had to respond instantly to the helmsman's touch. Creating the complex system of hinges, chains, and supports that allowed such a massive piece of wood to move freely demanded skills that bordered on the miraculous. The construction of the ship's internal structure was equally challenging. Bulkheads had to be fitted with perfect precision to provide structural support while creating separate compartments for cargo, crew, and supplies. These internal walls were often load-bearing elements that distributed the stresses of the sea throughout the ship's frame. A poorly constructed bulkhead could cause the entire vessel to twist and break apart in heavy weather. The installation of the masts represented another pinnacle of the shipbuilder's art. These towering spars, often reaching heights of over 100 feet, had to be perfectly balanced and supported by a complex web of rigging and stays. The mast step, the foundation that held the mast in place, required extraordinary engineering skills to create a joint that could withstand the enormous forces generated by wind and wave. The process of stepping a mast was a community effort that brought together dozens of workers. Using only ropes, pulleys, and human strength, they had to raise these massive timbers into vertical position with millimeter precision. A slight miscalculation could result in disaster, with the falling mast potentially killing or injuring multiple workers. The tension during these operations was palpable, with every man knowing that his life might depend on the skill and coordination of his fellows. As the ship neared completion, the final details required just as much skill and attention as the major structural elements. The carving of decorative elements, while beautiful, also served functional purposes, providing handholds for sailors and identifying marks for the vessel's owners. These carvings had to be executed with tools barely more sophisticated than those used by Stone Age craftsmen. Yet the results were often works of art that rivaled anything produced in the finest workshops. The application of protective coatings represented the final phase of construction, but it was no less demanding than what had come before. Multiple layers of tar, paint, and other preservatives had to be applied in precise sequence, each coat requiring perfect weather conditions and timing. Workers laboured in toxic fumes, their health sacrificed to protect the vessel that would soon carry precious cargo across dangerous seas. Throughout this entire process, the ancient shipbuilders worked without the benefit of modern safety equipment or medical care. Injuries were common and often severe. Crushed limbs from falling timbers, burns from hot tar and tools, cuts from sharp implements, and respiratory problems from constant exposure to toxic substances were accepted as part of the trade. Many craftsmen bore the scars of their profession, their twisted fingers and bent backs, testament to years of punishing labour. The mental strain was equally severe. These men carried the weight of enormous responsibility, knowing that any mistake in their work could result in the loss of the ship and everyone aboard. The pressure to maintain standards while working under brutal conditions took a psychological toll that we can barely imagine today. Yet they persevered, driven by pride in their craft and the knowledge that their skills were essential to their civilization's survival and prosperity. The seasonal nature of shipbuilding added another layer of hardship to their lives. Much of the work had to be completed during specific weather conditions, creating periods of frantic activity followed by unemployment and poverty. During the busy season, shipbuilders might work from dawn to dusk, 7 days a week, their bodies pushed to the breaking point. In the off-season, many faced hunger and destitution, forced to seek other work or rely on the charity of their communities. The tools they used were primitive by modern standards, yet in the hands of skilled craftsmen, they could produce results of extraordinary precision and beauty. Each shipbuilder owned and maintained his own tools, passed down through generations and modified to suit individual preferences and techniques. The loss or damage of these tools could be catastrophic, potentially ending a craftsman's career and condemning his family to poverty. The knowledge required to build ships was vast and complex, encompassing not only woodworking skills, but also mathematics, engineering, and an intimate understanding of the sea itself. This knowledge was closely guarded, passed down through apprenticeships that could last for decades. The master shipbuilders were the repositories of centuries of accumulated wisdom, their minds containing the secrets that kept their civilization afloat. As we reflect on the incredible demands placed upon these ancient craftsmen, we begin to understand the true cost of the vessels that enabled trade, exploration, and warfare. Every ship that sailed represented years of human suffering, countless hours of back-breaking labour, and the sacrifice of men who gave their health and often their lives to master one of humanity's most challenging crafts. The shipbuilder's artistry extended far beyond mere construction. It was an intricate dance of tradition, innovation, and survival that defined entire communities across the ancient world. As we've explored the grueling physical demands and sophisticated techniques required to create seaworthy vessels, we now turn to perhaps the most remarkable aspect of their craft, the profound knowledge systems that guided every decision, from the selection of timber to the final blessing of a completed ship. These master craftsmen operated within a complex web of understanding that encompassed not just woodworking techniques, but also astronomy, mathematics, metallurgy, and even mysticism. The shipwright's knowledge was encyclopedic by necessity. He needed to understand the behavior of different woods under stress, the patterns of wind and current, the properties of various adhesives and sealants, and the intricate geometry required to create a hull that would slice efficiently through water while remaining stable in heavy seas. The process of designing a vessel began long before the first timber was cut. Master shipbuilders would spend months, sometimes years, conceptualizing the perfect craft for its intended purpose. They understood that a warship required different proportions than a merchant vessel, that a river barge demanded distinct characteristics from an ocean-going trader. This knowledge was rarely written down. Instead, it lived in the minds and hands of the craftsmen, passed down through generations of apprenticeship in an unbroken chain stretching back centuries. The mathematical precision required was staggering. Without modern calculating tools, these artisans had to compute complex ratios and proportions entirely in their heads or through crude markings on wood and stone. They developed sophisticated systems for determining the optimal length to beam ratio, the proper curve for a keel, the ideal angle for a mast step. These calculations weren't mere approximations. A miscalculation of even a few degrees could result in a vessel that would capsize in the first strong wind or break apart under the stress of heavy seas. The selection of materials demanded equally profound expertise. A master shipwright could examine a tree and immediately assess its suitability for different parts of a vessel. The heartwood of an ancient oak might be perfect for a keel, while its outer layers could serve as planking. Cedar offered natural resistance to rot and insects, making it ideal for internal framing. Pine provided lightweight strength for masts and spars. Each species had its place in the grand design, and the shipbuilder's knowledge of these properties was gained through decades of experience and observation. The tools of the trade were extensions of the craftsman's body and mind. The adze, with its curved blade, could shape a timber with surgical precision in skilled hands. The shipwright's axe could fell a tree, rough shape a beam, or perform delicate finishing work depending on how it was wielded. Specialized planes, chisels, and boring tools each served specific purposes in the construction process. Many shipbuilders crafted their own tools, understanding that the subtle variations in edge geometry and handle length could mean the difference between effortless precision and back-breaking struggle. The joinery techniques employed by ancient shipbuilders were marvels of engineering ingenuity. Without metal fasteners, they relied on complex systems of wooden joints, lashings, and friction fits to hold their vessels together. Mortise and tenon joints, some reinforced with wooden pegs, created connections stronger than many modern mechanical fasteners. Scarf joints allowed builders to create long, continuous timbers from shorter pieces, with overlapping sections that actually grew stronger under load. The process of planking a hull required extraordinary skill and patience. Each plank had to be carefully shaped to follow the complex curves of the hull, a process that involved steaming, bending, and gradual fitting. The edges had to be beveled to create perfect joints with neighbouring planks, and the entire surface had to remain fair and smooth to minimize drag through the water. A skilled shipwright could install planking so precisely that the seams were nearly invisible, creating a whole surface as smooth as polished stone. Waterproofing presented constant challenges that demanded creative solutions. Various cultures developed different approaches to sealing their vessels against the relentless intrusion of seawater. Some used pine pitch and tar, applied hot, and worked into every seam and joint. Others employed natural materials like animal fat, beeswax, or even specially prepared plant fibers. The most sophisticated shipbuilders combined multiple techniques, creating layered barrier systems that could withstand years of exposure to salt water and harsh weather. The rigging of sailing vessels represented perhaps the most complex aspect of the shipbuilder's art. The arrangement of masts, yards, stays, and running rigging had to be precisely calculated to provide optimal performance while maintaining structural integrity. A single miscalculation in the placement of a mast step could create stress concentrations that would eventually tear the ship apart. The shipwright had to understand not just the static loads imposed by the rig, but also the dynamic forces generated by wind and wave action. The social structure of shipbuilding communities was as carefully organized as the construction process itself. Master craftsmen occupied positions of enormous respect and authority, their decisions affecting the livelihoods and safety of entire communities. Beneath them worked various specialists, caulkers, who sealed the seams, carvers who created decorative elements, metalworkers who forged the few iron components required. Each trade had its own traditions, techniques, and jealously guarded secrets. Apprenticeship in the shipbuilding trades was a lengthy and demanding process that began in childhood and continued well into adulthood. Young boys started by performing the most menial tasks, fetching tools, cleaning up wood shavings, tending fires. Gradually, they were allowed to observe more complex operations, then to assist with simple tasks under close supervision. Only after years of patient observation and practice were they trusted with independent work, and becoming a master craftsman could take decades. The economic impact of shipbuilding extended far beyond the yards themselves. These enterprises required enormous quantities of raw materials, from timber and rope to pitch and metal fittings. Entire forests were harvested to supply major shipbuilding operations, while rope makers, metal workers, and other suppliers formed extensive networks around the yards. The completion of a major vessel was often celebrated as a community-wide achievement, representing months or years of collective effort and investment. The dangers faced by shipbuilders were constant and often fatal. Working with heavy timbers, sharp tools, and complex machinery created numerous opportunities for serious injury or death. Falls from scaffolding or partially constructed hulls were common, as were crushing injuries from shifting timbers. The use of fire for bending wood and heating pitch created constant fire hazards, while the toxic fumes from various treatments and sealants posed long-term health risks that were poorly understood at the time. The seasonal nature of shipbuilding work created additional hardships for the workforce. Much construction had to be suspended during winter months when cold weather made certain operations impossible, and daylight hours were severely limited. Workers often faced months of unemployment or were forced to seek alternative occupations during these lean periods. The feast or famine nature of the work meant that even skilled craftsmen lived with constant economic uncertainty. Innovation in shipbuilding was a slow and often dangerous process. New techniques had to be tested on vessels that would carry human lives, creating powerful incentives for conservatism. However, competitive pressures and the demands of changing trade routes gradually drove technological advancement. Shipbuilders who could create faster, more maneuverable, or more capacious vessels gained significant advantages, but those whose innovations failed faced professional ruin and potential legal liability for any lives lost. The relationship between shipbuilders and their clients was complex and often fraught with tension. Wealthy merchants and naval commanders demanded vessels that met exacting specifications for speed, cargo capacity, and durability, but they also sought to minimize costs and construction time. Shipbuilders had to balance these competing demands while maintaining their professional reputations and ensuring the safety of their crews. Disputes over quality, delivery schedules, and payment were common, and sometimes led to lengthy legal battles. The spiritual and ritualistic aspects of shipbuilding were as important as the technical elements. Most cultures surrounded the construction and launching of vessels with elaborate ceremonies designed to ensure good fortune and divine protection. The selection of timber might be accompanied by offerings to forest spirits, while the laying of the keel required propitious timing according to astronomical observations. The launching itself was typically the occasion for major celebration, with religious blessings, community feasts, and elaborate rituals to consecrate the new vessel. The preservation and transmission of shipbuilding knowledge faced constant challenges. Without written manuals or technical drawings, the accumulated wisdom of generations could be lost if key practitioners died without passing on their expertise. Wars, plagues, and economic disruptions could decimate shipbuilding communities, taking with them centuries of refined techniques and hard-won experience. Some of the greatest shipbuilding traditions of the ancient world disappeared entirely, leaving only archaeological evidence of their former sophistication. The legacy of ancient shipbuilders extends far beyond their immediate historical context. The techniques they developed, refined through countless generations of practice and innovation, laid the foundations for all subsequent maritime technology. Their understanding of hydrodynamics, structural engineering, and materials science, gained through empirical observation and practical experience, anticipated many principles that would later be formalized by modern science. The vessels they created enabled the exploration, trade, and cultural exchange that shaped the development of human civilization. As we reflect on the extraordinary achievements of these ancient craftsmen, we gain a deeper appreciation for the complexity and sophistication of pre-industrial technology. Their work reminds us that human ingenuity and determination have always found ways to overcome seemingly impossible challenges, creating solutions of remarkable elegance and effectiveness, using only the materials and tools available to them. The ancient art of shipbuilding was not merely a craft. It was a delicate dance between life and death, where one misplaced stroke of the adze or poorly seasoned timber could mean the difference between safe harbor and a watery grave. As we delve deeper into this brutal world, we must examine the final stages of construction, where exhausted craftsmen face their most perilous challenges yet. The installation of the ship's rigging represented perhaps the most dangerous phase of the entire building process. Master riggers, their hands permanently stained with tar and their bodies bearing the scars of countless rope burns, would ascend towering masts that swayed precariously in the coastal winds. These men, often working at heights that would make modern construction workers blanch, had to thread massive hemp cables through blocks and pulleys while balancing on narrow yards suspended 50 feet above the ground. The rigging itself was a marvel of engineering complexity that demanded absolute precision. A single miscalculation in the tension of the standing rigging could result in a mast snapping like a twig in the first strong gale, sending tons of timber and iron crashing down upon the crew below. The running rigging, comprising hundreds of lines that controlled the ship's sails, required such intricate knowledge that riggers underwent apprenticeships lasting nearly a decade before they were trusted to work independently. Consider the life of Harold the Rope Walker, a master rigger who worked the shipyards of Bergen in the early 13th century. Harold had learned his trade from his father, who had learned it from his father before him, each generation passing down secrets of rope making and knot tying that were jealously guarded within their guild. Harold's hands, gnarled and scarred from years of handling rough hemp and manila, could splice a line in complete darkness, or judge the proper tension of a shroud by touch alone. But Harold's expertise came at a terrible cost. His body bore the marks of his profession. A crooked arm from a fall when a backstay parted, fingers missing from accidents with sharp cutting tools, and lungs that wheezed from years of breathing in tar fumes and hemp dust. At 45, Harold was considered an old man in his trade, his reflexes slowing just enough to make his work increasingly perilous. The physical demands of rigging work were matched only by the mental strain. A rigger had to keep track of dozens of different line types, each with its specific purpose and breaking strength. The shrouds that supported the mast had to be set up with mathematical precision, their angles calculated to distribute the enormous forces generated by wind-filled sails. The halyards that raised and lowered the sails required exact positioning to ensure smooth operation, while the braces that controlled the yards demanded careful coordination to prevent the massive spars from colliding with each other. Weather was the rigger's constant enemy. Winter installations were particularly brutal, as frozen fingers struggled to manipulate stiff ropes, while icy winds cut through even the thickest woolen clothing. Summer brought its own challenges, with the scorching sun turning tar-coated rigging into instruments of torture that could burn exposed skin in seconds. Rain made every surface treacherously slippery, while fog reduced visibility to mere feet, forcing riggers to work by feel alone. The economic pressures surrounding rigging work were equally unforgiving. Ship owners, eager to get their vessels into profitable service, constantly pushed for faster completion times. This meant riggers often worked in dangerous conditions they would normally avoid, climbing aloft in marginal weather or working through the night by flickering torchlight. The guild system provided some protection, but a rigger who refused dangerous work too often might find himself blacklisted from future employment. The social hierarchy within the rigging crews was as complex as the ropework itself. At the top stood the master rigger, whose word was absolute law when it came to the installation sequence and safety procedures. Below him worked the journeyman riggers, skilled craftsmen who could handle most tasks but lacked the experience to oversee major installations. At the bottom were the apprentices, young men who spent their days hauling heavy coils of rope and learning the fundamentals of knot tying while nursing bruises from inevitable mistakes. The tools of the rigging trade were deceptively simple, yet required years to master. The marlin spike, a pointed iron tool used for separating rope strands during splicing, became an extension of the rigger's hand through constant use. Fids, wooden tools used for opening rope, lay for splicing, were carved to fit each rigger's grip perfectly. Sharp knives, kept razor-sharp for cutting clean rope ends, were prized possessions that riggers guarded jealously and maintained with religious devotion. The actual rope used in ancient rigging was itself a product of incredible skill and labour. Hemp, the primary material, had to be grown, harvested, and processed through multiple stages before it could be twisted into usable cordage. The rope walks where this work was done stretched for hundreds of yards, requiring teams of workers to walk backwards while spinning fibres into yarn, then yarn into strands, and finally strands into rope. The quality of this rope quite literally held the ship together, making rope making one of the most crucial yet underappreciated aspects of shipbuilding. Different types of rigging served specific purposes that demanded different rope characteristics. Standing rigging, which provided permanent support for the masts, used the heaviest and strongest rope available, often coated with tar for weather protection. Running rigging, which had to move freely through blocks and tackle, required rope that was flexible yet strong, carefully chosen for its ability to bend repeatedly without breaking down. The shrouds, ratlines, and stays each had their own specifications, creating a complex web of requirements that challenged even the most experienced riggers. The installation process itself followed ancient traditions that had been refined over centuries. The lower shrouds went up first, providing basic support for the mast before additional rigging was added. Each shroud had to be tensioned precisely, using deadeyes and lanyards that allowed for fine adjustments. The process required multiple riggers working in coordination, communicating through a complex system of hand signals and shouted commands that could be understood over the noise of construction. As the rigging neared completion, the tension in the shipyard became palpable. This was the moment when years of work would be tested, when the accumulated skills of dozens of craftsmen would either triumph or fail catastrophically. The first time the masts bore their full complement of rigging was a moment of supreme anxiety, with everyone watching for signs of stress or failure in the complex web of rope and wood. But even successful rigging installation was merely the beginning of the rope's working life. The constant stretching and shrinking caused by changing weather conditions meant that rigging required continuous adjustment and maintenance. New rope stretched significantly in its first months of service, requiring regular retensioning to maintain proper support. Hemp rope also deteriorated rapidly when exposed to salt water and UV radiation, meaning that rigging had a finite lifespan that ship owners ignored at their peril. The economic impact of rigging work extended far beyond the shipyard itself. The demand for high-quality rope drove entire industries, from hemp farming to rope walk operations. Coastal communities often specialized in rigging work, developing expertise that was passed down through generations of maritime families. The knowledge required was so specialized that skilled riggers could command premium wages, making them among the more prosperous members of the shipbuilding community. Yet prosperity came with a price that extended beyond the immediate dangers of the work. Riggers aged quickly under the physical demands of their trade, with many unable to continue climbing aloft by their 50th birthday. Those who survived to old age often suffered from chronic pain and disabilities that made their final years a struggle for survival. The guild system provided some support for disabled members, but resources were limited and help was often inadequate. The psychological toll of rigging work was equally severe. The constant awareness that a single mistake could result in death or serious injury created a level of stress that few modern workers can imagine. Riggers developed superstitions and rituals designed to ward off accidents, from specific knots tied for luck to prayers offered before ascending particularly dangerous masts. These practices provided psychological comfort, but could not eliminate the very real dangers inherent in the work. Weather delays added another layer of complexity to rigging operations. Unlike many other aspects of shipbuilding that could continue in marginal conditions, rigging work was completely dependent on favorable weather. Strong winds made work aloft impossible, while rain turned rope slippery and dangerous to handle. These delays could stretch rigging installation over weeks or even months, adding to costs and frustrating ship owners eager to see their investments completed. The training of new riggers was itself a dangerous endeavor that claimed many young lives. Apprentices learned by doing, starting with simple tasks on deck, before gradually working their way up the masts. Even basic rope handling could be dangerous for inexperienced hands, as hemp rope under tension could easily break bones or sever fingers if handled incorrectly. Many apprentices bore permanent scars from their early training, badges of their initiation into this dangerous brotherhood. The seasonal nature of much shipbuilding work meant that riggers often faced periods of unemployment during winter months, when construction slowed or stopped entirely. This forced many to seek alternative employment or travel to warmer climates where work continued year-round. The uncertainty of employment added financial stress to an already dangerous profession, making it difficult for riggers to plan for their futures or support their families adequately. As ships grew larger and more complex throughout the medieval period, rigging systems became correspondingly more sophisticated and dangerous. What had once been manageable installations on smaller vessels became major engineering challenges, requiring teams of specialists working in perfect coordination. The margin for error decreased as the consequences of failure increased, creating an environment where even experienced riggers faced constant peril. The legacy of these ancient riggers lives on in the maritime traditions that survive to this day. Their techniques for rope splicing, their methods for tensioning standing rigging, and their understanding of load distribution continue to influence modern yacht rigging and traditional sailing vessels. The dawn light filtered through the narrow windows of the shipyard workshop as ancient craftsmen stirred from their brief rest. Their bodies, already bearing the accumulated aches of decades spent hunched over timber and twisted around ship frames, protested against another day of relentless labor. Yet they rose, as they had every morning for years, knowing that the vessels they built would carry the fate of kingdoms across treacherous waters. The life of an ancient shipbuilder was one of profound contradiction. These master craftsmen possessed knowledge that could determine the success of entire naval expeditions, yet they lived as virtual prisoners of their own expertise. Kings and admirals understood that letting such valuable artisans fall into enemy hands could spell disaster. Shipbuilders found themselves bound not just by guild obligations and royal contracts, but by the very real threat of death should they attempt to share their secrets with rival nations. Consider the predicament of Marcus, a master shipwright in the naval yards of ancient Rome. His knowledge of hull construction techniques had helped build the vessels that secured Roman dominance in the Mediterranean. Yet this same expertise made him a target for assassination by rival powers and a prisoner of his own value to the empire. He could never travel freely, never retire to a quiet life in the countryside, never even speak openly about his work outside the confines of the shipyard. His skills had become both his greatest asset and his eternal chains. The physical demands of shipbuilding in the ancient world defied modern comprehension. Without mechanical aids, every massive timber had to be moved by human strength alone. Teams of workers would spend entire days maneuvering single beams into position, their muscles straining against loads that would challenge modern machinery. The process of shaping a ship's hull required craftsmen to contort their bodies into impossible positions, working in cramped spaces between massive ribs of oak and pine for hours on end. The workshop of Ptolemy's shipyard in Alexandria buzzed with activity as dozens of craftsmen attacked their specialized tasks. The sound was overwhelming, a cacophony of hammering, sawing and shouting that never ceased from sunrise to sunset. Sawyers worked in pairs, one standing above and one below massive logs, pulling great two-man saws through timber with rhythmic precision. Each stroke required perfect coordination, and a single mistake could send the heavy saw blade careening dangerously off course. The art of selecting timber required knowledge passed down through generations of shipbuilders. Master craftsmen could examine a tree and predict exactly how its wood would behave under the stress of ocean waves. They understood which trees growing on which slopes would provide the strongest planks, which heartwood would resist rot, and which grain patterns would bend without breaking under extreme loads. This knowledge was guarded jealously, shared only between master and carefully chosen apprentice in whispered conversations away from competing ears. Ancient shipbuilders faced the constant challenge of working with green timber, wood that still contained its natural moisture and would continue to shrink and shift as the ship aged. They had to anticipate these changes, building in deliberate gaps and adjustments that would allow the vessel to settle into its final form over months or even years of service. A miscalculation could result in a ship that literally tore itself apart as the timber dried and contracted. The process of steam bending massive planks into the curved shapes required for hull construction pushed both wood and craftsmen to their absolute limits. Workers would spend hours stoking fires under enormous steam boxes, creating the intense heat and moisture needed to make thick oak planks pliable enough to bend. Then came the dangerous work of removing the scalding timber and forcing it into position before it cooled and became rigid again. Burns from steam and hot wood were so common that most shipbuilders bore permanent scars across their hands and forearms. Joining techniques in ancient shipbuilding required precision that would challenge modern craftsmen. Without power tools, every joint had to be cut by hand with chisels and saws. Mortise and tenon joints that would hold the ship together through decades of pounding waves had to be measured and cut to tolerances of fractions of inches. A single poorly fitted joint could create a weak point that would eventually doom the entire vessel and everyone aboard it. The caulking process, sealing the gaps between planks to make the hull watertight, represented one of the most critical and dangerous aspects of shipbuilding. Craftsmen would drive oakum, tarred rope fibers into every seam using specialized tools and mallets. The work required them to hang over the sides of ships under construction, suspended by ropes and working in positions that offered no room for error. A fall could mean death or crippling injury, yet the work could not be rushed. Lives would depend on every carefully sealed joint. Ancient shipbuilders developed an almost supernatural understanding of wood grain and structural forces. They could feel stress patterns in timber, sensing weak points that might not become apparent until a vessel encountered its first serious storm. This intuitive knowledge came only through decades of experience, often purchased at the cost of watching ships they had built return damaged or not return at all. The creation of sails, represented another specialized craft within the shipbuilding trade. Master sail makers worked with enormous pieces of canvas, cutting and stitching with techniques that balanced strength against weight. They understood how different weaves would respond to various wind conditions, how to reinforce stress points without adding unnecessary bulk, and how to shape sails that would efficiently capture wind from multiple directions. The work required both the precision of a tailor and the strength of a laborer, as the finished sails could weigh hundreds of pounds. Rope making for ancient ships demanded its own specialized knowledge and incredible physical endurance. Craftsmen would walk backward for hundreds of yards, spinning individual fibers into ever thicker strands, then combining those strands into the massive cables needed for rigging and anchors. The work never stopped, as ships constantly needed replacement rigging due to wear and weather damage. Rope makers developed distinctive gaits and postures from years of walking backward while managing heavy, twisting fibers. The installation of rigging on completed vessels required shipbuilders to become part sailor, part acrobat. They climbed to dizzying heights to attach lines and blocks, working on narrow masts that swayed dangerously even in calm conditions. Every line had to be positioned precisely, as the complex web of rigging controlled every aspect of the ship's movement and stability. A single misplaced rope could render a vessel unmanageable or cause catastrophic failure in heavy weather. Metal fittings for ancient ships had to be forged by hand in blazing furnaces that turned workshops into infernos. Blacksmiths working on ship components created massive anchors, reinforcing bands, and countless smaller fittings, each one custom-made for its specific purpose. The heat from forges combined with the physical demands of hammerwork in the confined spaces of shipyards created working conditions that few modern laborers could endure. The economics of ancient shipbuilding trapped craftsmen in cycles of feast and famine. When war threatened or trade expanded, shipbuilders worked around the clock with steady pay and high demand for their skills. But when peace returned or economic conditions shifted, the same craftsmen might find themselves unemployed for months, their highly specialized skills useless in other trades. Many spent their entire savings during slow periods, only to return to poverty when the next shipbuilding boom began. Quality control in ancient shipyards operated through brutal practical testing. Ships were subjected to deliberate stress tests that would reveal any weaknesses in construction. Craftsmen watched nervously as their vessels were loaded beyond normal capacity, sailed in deliberately rough conditions, and pushed to their limits. Failure meant not just lost work and reputation, but potential prosecution or even execution if the ship was intended for royal or military service. The social hierarchy within ancient shipyards created additional pressures for craftsmen at every level. Master builders enjoyed respect and substantial income, but bore crushing responsibility for every aspect of vessel construction. Journeymen possessed valuable skills, but lacked the authority to make critical decisions, often bearing blame for failures that resulted from others' choices. Apprentices endured years of dangerous, exhausting work with minimal pay, knowing that most would never advance to master status. Training new shipbuilders required master craftsmen to balance the need for skilled assistance against the risk of creating future competitors. Knowledge was shared grudgingly and incompletely, with crucial techniques revealed only after years of proven loyalty. Many apprentices spent decades learning their trade, only to discover that their masters had withheld essential knowledge that would prevent them from ever achieving true independence. The international nature of shipbuilding created additional complications for ancient craftsmen. Techniques and materials varied dramatically between different maritime cultures, and shipbuilders often found themselves working with foreign methods they didn't fully understand. Language barriers complicated instructions and safety procedures, leading to accidents and misunderstandings that could prove fatal in the dangerous environment of active shipyards. Weather represented a constant enemy for ancient shipbuilders working in outdoor yards, without protection from the elements. Rain could ruin carefully prepared materials, Wind could topple partially constructed vessels, and extreme temperatures made many construction techniques impossible. Yet work continued regardless of conditions, as delivery schedules demanded by royal and military clients allowed no delays for mere weather. The preservation of wood in ancient shipbuilding required constant vigilance against rot, insects, and other forms of decay. Craftsmen developed elaborate techniques for treating timber with various oils, tars, and other protective substances, many of which were toxic or carcinogenic. The long-term health effects of exposure to these preservatives were unknown, but shipbuilders had little choice but to work with whatever materials provided the best protection for their vessels. Tool maintenance represented a never-ending challenge for ancient shipbuilders, working with hand tools that required constant sharpening and repair. A dull chisel or damaged saw could ruin hours of careful work, while a broken tool might be impossible to replace quickly in remote shipyard locations. Craftsmen spent significant portions of their time maintaining their implements, and the loss of essential tools could mean the end of their ability to work. The logistics of ancient shipbuilding required coordinating materials and workers from across vast regions. Timber might come from forests hundreds of miles away, metals from distant mines, and specialized craftsmen from other kingdoms or city-states. Managing these supply chains without modern communication or transportation created constant crises that shipbuilders had to resolve while maintaining construction schedules. Fire represented perhaps the greatest fear in ancient shipyards, filled with dry timber, flammable preservatives, and open flames from forges and torches. A single carelessly managed fire could destroy months of work and eliminate the livelihood of dozens of craftsmen. Yet fire was essential for many construction processes, creating a constant tension between necessary risk and potential catastrophe. The completion of a major vessel represented both triumph and terror for ancient shipbuilders. Success brought prestige and financial reward, but failure could result in punishment ranging from financial ruin to execution. The moment when a new ship first entered the water was the ultimate test of months or years of grueling labor, with the craftsmen's reputations and sometimes their lives hanging in the balance. The legacy of ancient shipbuilders extended far beyond the vessels they created. Their innovations in engineering, materials science, and manufacturing techniques influenced countless other trades and technologies. The legacy of these ancient shipbuilders stretched far beyond their individual lifespans, weaving itself into the very fabric of maritime civilization. As the medieval period drew to a close and new horizons beckoned, the accumulated wisdom of generations of craftsmen had created something remarkable, a foundation of knowledge so robust that it would carry humanity across uncharted oceans. In the great shipyards of Venice, Genoa, and the Baltic ports, master builders had perfected techniques that seemed almost mystical in their precision. They could look at a piece of timber and know instantly whether it would bend gracefully into a ship's ribs or split under pressure. Their hands could shape wood with such finesse that joints fitted together like puzzle pieces, creating vessels that could flex with the waves rather than fight against them. The guild system that had tortured individual craftsmen with its rigid hierarchies had, paradoxically, created an unparalleled network of knowledge sharing. When a Venetian shipwright travelled to Constantinople or a Hanseatic builder worked in London, they carried with them not just their personal skills, but the collective wisdom of their entire tradition. Trade routes became conduits for technical innovation, with each port adding its own refinements to the ancient arts. Perhaps most remarkably, these craftsmen had solved problems that would challenge engineers even today. They developed methods for creating watertight seals, using only natural materials, pine tar, and oakum forced into seams with such precision that their ships could sail for months without major leaking. They understood the complex mathematics of hull design long before the formal science of naval architecture existed, creating vessels that could carry maximum cargo while remaining stable in the roughest seas. The economic impact of their work was staggering. The ships they built enabled the spice trade that connected Europe to Asia, the fishing fleets that fed growing populations, and the merchant vessels that carried goods between distant cities. Without their expertise, the very concept of global commerce would have remained impossible. Every bolt of silk from China, every load of grain from the Baltic, every barrel of wine from France depended on their craftsmanship. But it was in the realm of exploration that their true legacy shines brightest. The ships that carried Columbus to the Americas, Vasco da Gama around Africa, and Magellan across the Pacific were direct descendants of the vessels crafted by medieval shipbuilders. The techniques for creating strong, flexible hulls capable of withstanding oceanic voyages had been perfected over centuries of gradual refinement. The knowledge of how to step masts that could carry enormous sails, how to create rudder systems that could control massive vessels, and how to balance cargo loads for optimal sailing performance. All of this came from the accumulated wisdom of countless anonymous craftsmen. The social transformation enabled by their work was equally profound. Maritime trade created new classes of merchants and financiers, challenged the feudal order with networks of urban commerce, and facilitated the exchange of ideas that would fuel the Renaissance. The ships built in medieval yards carried not just goods, but knowledge, manuscripts, scholars, artists, and innovations that would reshape European civilization. Even their failures contributed to progress. Every ship that foundered in a storm, every hull that cracked under stress, every mast that snapped in high winds, taught valuable lessons that were incorporated into future designs. The shipbuilding community developed an almost scientific approach to learning from disasters, constantly refining their techniques based on hard-won experience. The environmental knowledge embedded in their craft was extraordinary. They understood seasonal variations in wood quality, knew which trees from which regions would provide the best materials for specific purposes, and developed sustainable harvesting practices that could maintain forest resources over generations. Their relationship with the natural world was one of deep understanding rather than simple exploitation. As we reflect on their contributions from our modern vantage point, it becomes clear that these ancient shipbuilders achieved something truly remarkable. Working with hand tools and empirical knowledge, facing constant dangers and economic uncertainties, they created the maritime technology that would transform the world. Their innovations in hull design, rigging systems, and construction techniques laid the groundwork for every subsequent advance in naval architecture. The ships they built carried humanity into a new age, an age of global exploration, international trade, and cultural exchange that continues to shape our world today. Every cargo container that crosses the Pacific, every cruise ship that navigates the Mediterranean, every fishing vessel that braves the North Atlantic, carries within its design the accumulated wisdom of those long-ago craftsmen who learned their trade through blood, sweat, and unwavering dedication. Their story reminds us that progress often comes not through dramatic breakthroughs, but through the patient accumulation of knowledge passed down from master to apprentice across generations. In their hammers and adzes, their measuring techniques and joinery methods, their understanding of wood and water and wind, they preserved and advanced the technologies that would ultimately shrink the world and connect distant peoples. The grueling life of ancient shipbuilders was indeed marked by hardship and sacrifice, but it was also illuminated by the profound satisfaction of creating something lasting and meaningful. So as we drift into sleep tonight, let us remember these hardy souls of medieval Scotland, the clan warriors and humble peasants, the shepherds and craftsmen who endured unimaginable hardships yet never lost their fierce spirit. Their struggles forged a nation's character, their resilience echoing through the centuries in every stone castle and windswept glen. Though their names may be forgotten and their stories lost to time, their legacy lives on in the indomitable Scottish spirit that refuses to be broken, reminding us that even in the darkest of ages, the human heart can find strength, dignity, and hope. Rest well, knowing that their sacrifices paved the way for the freedoms we cherish today.